welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and how the best writers risk being strange. And my guest today is Natalee Caple, a dear friend and the author of many books, including the book that we'd like to talk about today, The Calamity's Wake. This talk was part of a class that I was doing at the University of Winnipeg. In addition to thanking Natalee for joining myself in the class, I'd like to thank the students in the class, also the University of Winnipeg itself for helping me bring Natalee to the class. Without further ado, let's get right into the conversation with Natalee Caple. Natalee, I just want to dive right into talking about you and your book.
Okay.
So, again, the book that my students are studying is In Calamity's Wake, your recent but not your latest book. And I'm just and of course, if people haven't read the novel, people here who are not in my class haven't read the novel. The book is what you call meta-historiographic fiction, in that it has, its basis in reality. It is fiction, but it has a foot in reality, specifically the reality of Calamity Jane, this Western mythic figure who did live. And I'm curious if you could just talk maybe a little bit about what first interested you in Calamity Jane, and kind of brought you to write this novel, and maybe kind of what you mean exactly by meta-historiographic fiction.
So Linda Hutcheon is a Canadian academic. I think she's retired now. She worked at U of T, and she wrote about post-colonialism, and she tended to talk a lot about kind of micro genres. And so she wanted to talk about what she thought was specific to postmodern fiction in Canada. And she created a term, and her term is actually historiographic metafiction. And her idea is that contemporary Canadian post-colonial literature, or postmodern, sorry, not post-colonial, I suppose it is also post-colonial, but it's postmodern literature, does a number of things. It both references and holds up the things that it talks about, while simultaneously taking apart and exploring the way that those things work, and that it's highly self-referential, it's highly interpolated with other literatures, and that it involves a great deal of responding to popular culture and where it comes from. And I thought this was actually a great model for a process for producing a work. And while I was doing it and looking at, and so I am talking about Calamity Jane as well, and I started looking at Calamity Jane, one of the things that really struck me is that when we're talking about the making of America and the Americas, including Canada, because so much of our mythology we share, right? We share a border, we share a lot of, particularly in the West, a lot of geography and in some ways, I think when you're out West, and I was living out West, there's a way in which people who live on the land might identify more closely with other ranchers across the border or people across the same mountain range than they would necessarily identify with nationality. And at this time, actually, in the States, the idea of nation is being established. And so the states are not all on the same commitment level. At the same time, who we're going to be in North America as settlers, not indigenous people, right, is being created. It's being projected. So when we talk about mythology, particularly popular mythology, it's kind of a projection of who you want to be versus it takes bits and pieces of what is true and certainly the figures of the time, Calamity Jane is a real person, Wild Bill Hickok is a real person, but they're being fictionalized in novels, in like characters in newspapers, and they're being created. They're being used to create these kind of projections of who are the heroes of the Wild West. How are we different from the motherlands, right? From the Britons of the world and the Europeans of the world. Like, how are we rougher, tougher? How are we, right? And so what I realized was that there are very few reliable records, but there are many, many, many fragments. And so sometimes this person, Calamity Jane, who is a real person, might appear in a newspaper to be in two places at once. And this could be because communities would have their own person that they called Calamity Jane. It could be, somebody who drank a lot, for example. It could be because somebody has created it whole scale. It could be a mistake. And so this woman who's in her lifetime being mythologized and not benefiting from it, right? Like, she's incredibly poor, but she might buy a pack of cigarettes or find a pack of cigarettes and find a card in it, like a trading card with her own caricatured image, which is extraordinarily romanticized. And so at a certain point in time, people might disparage her. Certainly at her death, like, she was not, so there are parts of, it's hard to tell unless you know which parts of the novel are historical record and which parts are not, because there's so much. I decided to include all of it, even the contradicting stories, because I thought that worked very well for postmodern work. And I also felt that it was worth changing around. Got a little eraser here. I don't know why I'm playing with an eraser, but I am. It's because of postmodernism. That's why
Well, you have those three opening stories.
Yeah,
where
so there
you
are
tell
three
her
opening
birth three
stories.
times. Mm-hmm.
So there were, maybe, are there three or are there four? I think there's, anyway.
At the very start, you've got the three. She was born three times, or is it four? Yeah, now that you say that, I'm just...
There's no birth certificate, and people argue bitterly about when she was born. And it's interesting to me that they seem to not accept her word for it, right? Which in her story is the most banal, right? And so I thought, this is really interesting. This is a kind of mythic figure, a figure that has multiple births. So I'll include all of the births, and I'll add a last one. And the last one, the one that I added, is the one of the kind of like the feral wolf child, which is actually a story of a child out of Texas from about 100 years earlier, right? And so when I chose to sort of play with the concept of historiographic metafiction, what I wanted to point out was that not only is fiction very curated and self-referential and reflects the position of the looker at any given time, so too does history. So too is history an assemblage, right? A pastiche of information that is funneled through a perspective. And when you take away the illusion of a cohesive, true story, what you do still see is something that is quite like heartbreakingly complex and situated within a kind of social and historical time in which there's a need being filled by the way we tell a story, right? We're telling a story about a woman, not to help her, not because she needs it told, but because we need something. And to some extent, where she doesn't fit into that, she gets destroyed. And so towards the end of the book, the things that you would be surprised perhaps are true, is that there was the grand funeral, right? There was everybody suddenly saying, I was there at her deathbed. I did this, I did that. We were great friends, right? But in fact, she was sick on a train, and the conductor decided to just basically leave her at a station that was just by itself in the middle of nowhere. And basically she, basically died alone. And I sent her daughter to go and get her and bring her back so that she would be cared for. Her bodily self would have that love at the very end. So in many ways, the book resists the idea that she can be properly historicized, but acknowledges that nevertheless she's deep in the culture. To this day, my kid is working at the Humane Society, and there's a cat they've just named Calamity Jane, right? There was something so imperative about what she meant, and it's not one thing that she meant, that we keep finding a way to use it again, right? She's very much a part of the material culture. She's in every kind of technology, film, radio, television, and she gets revisited over and over again as we try to figure out who we are, and as we kind of renegotiate the problems about how we've told the story of who we are, and our failures to account for our own responsibilities. Even as I revisit the book, there are things that I would do differently, right? Because I now feel as a white writer in Canada, there are some things that I feel like I shouldn't have done. And so, but 10 years ago, I was within the context of media models.
What do you think? It's interesting you mentioned that, Calamity Jane's this figure who kind of became a flashpoint for people to project their visions into, and they kind of start writing a story over her, as you sort of say, and what doesn't. I like the way you put it. What doesn't kind of fit, the story kind of gets destroyed. I'm curious to know. I always think about this with celebrities. Even today, we see this, especially
she's one of those first celebrities.
Yeah, and one of the first, American celebrities and folk heroes or villains, as it were. You see this in history with different figures. You see it in politics and the culture nowadays. You see it all the time. But I'm always interested in why certain people become those flashpoints. I was curious if you have any inkling or sense of what it is about Calamity Jane that kind of made her so attractive to people, or just fascinated people in this way.
She's got an attraction repulsion quality to her. And when I was presenting the book I launched it in the States in Deadwood, and all around Deadwood, they have these giant posters of the famous figures like Wild Bill Hickok, like Poker Alice, like Calamity Jane, everywhere. And this is part of how they subsist is by attracting people to talk about this history. It's a very small place, right? And people have great pride in what they know, but there are other people who loathe her, right? There was a lineup of people getting books signed, and I had my poster of her up, and this woman came out to me and she said, I live here, and I just want you to know that woman was a whore. And which I did know, actually. And prostitutes are founding members of many societies, if not all, right? So that wasn't, and she's and I've been petitioning the town to take down, she was an alcoholic and a whore, and I've been petitioning the town to take down her image everywhere, and I'd really like you to help me. And I was I'm sorry, I can't help you. But people have their different, people don't want to be associated with her, and the person that she is in the comics is a very pretty and glamorous version of her that's kind of fainting into the arms of various people. But what they needed was the idea of the kind of woman who could match the man of of the time. She was an incredible sharpshooter. Annie Oakley was a sharpshooter as well, but she was a performer and not actually in the army. So the story of this kind of cross-dressing woman who could do almost anything and had lived almost every life, had been a rancher, had been in the army, had been kind of like at these major events and close to these major people, made her very useful for telling those stories.
I guess she's kind of protein in that way.
Yeah, because when you're talking about that period, you're actually talking about a small place and a short period of time. Like the mythology is big, but the period of time and the place is very small. And so the people encounter each other. They, in the case of Wild Bill Hickok, he doesn't live very long when he gets to Deadwood. He's this big figure, but he's really not there for very long before he dies. And there's just, there's not that many figures like her. Like she does draw attention to herself at the time. Like she's in no way, I think part of the book really wanted to examine the many, many roles that women have. Like if you look in the nonfiction, they're all over the place, right? They were business owners. They were miners. They were like, this is a place that doesn't really have government at this point. And if we don't have government, people are just doing the jobs that need to be done. Right. They're not like, there's no like, oh, you can't hire so-and-so, that person can't vote exactly. Like this is a different. So what's wild about the West is actually work. Right.
Yeah, even here you had, I'm in Winnipeg right now, and in Winnipeg at one point, voted in, or the area I'm from, I should say, which is in northern Ontario. At one point, there was a discussion as to where it would be. Would it be in Ontario? Would it be in Manitoba? Everyone there ended up voting in both elections, until they kind of sorted it out. And that was, a later period even. They still hadn't figured a lot of this stuff out until, surprisingly recently in some respects.
And whether or not women could or should be citizens was a very hot topic. And it wasn't just a hot topic in North America, which was forming itself, but it was, North America, settler North America, right? Like this is, Indigenous culture had embraced, multiple Indigenous cultures have multiple roles for women, right? Already well established. But settlers have come over from Europe. They don't want to be European, but the big question at the time, when you think about like what's going on in modern society, is the woman question, right? Like, is a woman a full citizen? Is she like an equal to a man? What does that even mean? And so Calamity Jane is both a good and a bad figure. Suffragism is happening, right? She's actually very much disliked by suffragists because of her drinking. But at the same time, she's a very useful character to show that this idea of women being able to do anything that a man can do. So she's kind of subversive, but she's a very complex person. And so she doesn't work as herself. She doesn't work for any of the groups that would like to mobilize her. So she really has to be kind of erased and remade in these like fictional characters.
Now, when you were sort of remaking her and making this novel, you ended up with this sort of cross-cutting structure where we're kind of focused on Miette, and then we're moving from Miette to Calamity, Miette's journey, and then Calamity's sort of life and history, and all the sort of things involved in that. I wonder why and how you settled on that precise structure, and the degree to which you might consider Miette's story to be a picaresque.
Yeah, well, I consider them both. I was trying to create a kind of helixed picaresque where there were two stories that would happen, and that it ends with an epilogue, but it doesn't have a prologue. So there's this idea of a kind of openness at the beginning where, in theory, other people's stories can be inserted. And even though this is the story of Calamity Jane, it's also a story of the working poor. And there are these many, many, many voices, many of which are like taken actually or speaking words that they actually spoke, right? And so there's this idea of the Old West as white, male, straight, and that was never true. And it was very important for me to show that that was a curated vision of the West, right? Of a kind of heroic vision of the West. But this is post the Civil War, right? 20% of cowboys were Black, ranchers as well. There was a very large Chinatown in next only to San Francisco, in Deadwood. So this was never an all-white space. Obviously, there's a large number of surrounding Indigenous communities and Indigenous people also working in the town and trading. And I remember, like, at one point I'd read a document about Calamity Jane, and I'd wonder why they had interpreted something a certain way. So, for example, there's this interpretation of her as a terrible scout, right? And so I went and I talked to, because she'd be taking these people en route, and her job would be to protect them from the terrible Indigenous people, right? The dangerous Indigenous people. And they would never, and in this text it said, and they never encountered any. And so she was a terrible scout. And I thought, like, that's really a strange read. And so I took it to Indigenous historian, and I said, what is going on here? Like, is it possible that you could cross this amount of space and not run into a community, right? Because that doesn't seem right to me. Like, we have this idea now of like segregated pockets, but they weren't segregated pockets then. Like, we were pushing our way in to places where there were people, right? You didn't have to like go looking for people. There were people. And so they just don't show up very much in the movies, right? Because that's a story we don't like. And they said, no, like, if they didn't encounter people, it was because of an arrangement, right? Because the Indigenous people have their scouts as well. They're also protecting their people, right? So if she's crossing there and that group of people never encountered anybody, that was just to keep everybody safe. And there would be no surprises. And so nothing would happen to anybody. There's nothing about her being a bad scout. And the other thing is that people then said, okay, well, maybe she was actually a bad shot because she never actually killed anybody. So you have this famous gunslinger who never kills anybody. Like, what does that mean? And when I thought about that, I thought, well, that's a really interesting problem for a Western, because it means that we can't have a showdown, right? So what am I going to do with that? Like, and then I thought, that has to be a choice, because she was a sharpshooter. And when she would perform, even in her later years, and she would travel and perform, like, can you imagine performing who you are and like the end of your own era? Like, but she would do this, but she would be performing by shooting, right? Shooting and riding. So so she had to choose. And there's plenty of records of her threatening to shoot people, right? Like, she gets in lots of fights, but clearly she chooses not to shoot people, right? And I thought, this is a profoundly interesting character trait. Because when you look at, like, Wild Bill Hickok shot people dead, shot his own friends dead, Buffalo Bill did, like, when you look at the stories of a lot of the very famous men in the Old West and most people in the Old West, you would think you could not get through life without shooting somebody dead, right? Like, there's just like, it's going off everywhere. You don't want to shoot your friend, but at some point you're probably going to shoot a friend, right? Like, everybody does it. But for some reason, this person who's supposed to be a sharpshooter, who's in the army, who's at battles, never shoots a single person. So that just has to be, to my mind, that had to be a decision. And so that was how I approached that in the text. And that was how I was able to make it what I felt was an anti-violent Western, right? That was pro-social and that was pro-working class voices. It was a really fascinating journey to try and find out who the surrounding people were and what their voices were like. Because when you look for the stories of the poor, you can't just find them, right? Like they don't have biographies and biographers and people doing their stuff because they're they're not kings and queens. So you often find it in places like the legal records or agricultural records or things like that. And then you find out like what people were arguing about, like the whole story about how the prostitution house claims that it's a cat house, and how we get that expression. We get that expression from that legal case where they declare that it's a house full of cats. It's not a prostitution. These women are actually taking care of the cats, right? So it's a cat house. And so it was really interesting to find out some of the deep cultural impact that we still have that we don't even know about, like expressions that we still have that we don't even know where they came from.
It's interesting you note the nonfiction sort of status of some of these, histories of the poor, of the normal class, or whatever you want to call them, because it made me think of, some of the oldest records we have, like just human records of, from Babylonia or Egypt, are like ledgers accounting, like this guy owes this person 5 cows or whatever.
Yeah.
And we don't think of it as literature, of course, but there is a sort of way in which it is sort of our literary evidence, in a manner of speaking, or our evidence of the kind of, like, if you go far enough back, you don't really have other records, like in many respects.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to collapse the value judgment around high and low culture and say that there is a kind of irreducible value of every human life. And where do you find it? Because then there's a kind of irreducible value of every record, right? So a list, a law case, like these things are as valuable as any like great work of art.
And they tell a story, or suggest a story, or allow for a story to be told, as it were, which, as you say, kind of in some ways starts to become the process of writing history itself, which we then take for a record rather than being a story. I'd like to just take a second to see if other people have some questions. Before since I know you have to go at about 15 or so. Does anyone else have a question they want to jump in here? I've got some other ones I can ask, but I just want to open it up for a second if anyone wants to raise their hand or just sort of unmute and leap in. Otherwise, I would really like you to talk a bit about a more abstract thing if you can. I know it's a bit of a older book at this point, but I really find your style fascinating, your like line by line style in general, but especially in this book, because I feel it's a very dense and elegant style, but it doesn't read like, it reads it in a very breezy manner, but yet you've got these very complicated and dense sentences. Like the one that really struck out to me when I reread this one recently was at the very start of the book, you've got this her Miette's father, or her stepfather, is dying, and you've got this sentence, the drops of oil, where he's having the oil cross on his head, and the line is like, the drops of oil reminded me of the drops of water I'd watched him draw on the foreheads of infants over all the years that were now being swept away. Like, to me, that's a very complicated sentence, where you've got like the drops of oil, you've got the image of that compared to the drops of water. You've got that kind of parallelism of the two. You've got the motion of it drawing the memory and the motion of, this person is dying, but also like go back to like a young child who's just recently been born, having the same cross sort of drawn on the forehead, but in a different material over all the years. So then remembering all the times he's done this. She's not just remembering having seen it. She's remembering seen him do it multiple times. And then you've got this great ending line, like, but all that stuff is being swept away now. Because he's dying, all that. Although those things happened, there's a sense in which their existence or their memory is kind of being swept away with his death. Like somehow they were also part of him. And there's just a lot going on in a sense like that, but it has a very simple and breezy kind of elegance to it. And I think you could easily miss a lot of it. I feel like that's the kind of a hallmark of your style. What I'm always impressed with when I read your stuff is that you do that like constantly. like a lot of people will get a line like that off every now and again, but you're like doing it like line after line after line after line. And I just can't imagine how much work it is. Just as a writer myself, I just look at it.
Layering.
Yeah.
Right?
And I'm just kind of curious.
It's like a million drafts, right?
Well, I mean, I just like to know just a bit more about how you actually approach a book like this stylistically, and is there a way in which you kind of like, when do you get to the point where you feel like the architecture or the structure of that story is working, or how do you get those lines working? I know it's such a massive question. And I know there's no real answer in a sense, but I wonder if like how you kind of started to develop that kind of style, or if you could talk a bit about why you think it was the right style.
Yeah. I tell my creative writing students that, like, if you haven't lost faith, then you haven't gone far enough, right? Like, sure. So when do you know? It's, I don't know, like I go through so many periods of like, this is garbage. What am I doing? Like, I went halfway through this book, I was ready to throw it out. And then it became so precious. And then there are these points where things just gel. So you just keep trying things, trying to get voices, trying scenes, trying images, and trying to think about what is the point of this moment, right? So how do I describe it, but also what is the point of this moment? So in that particular sentence, it's actually interesting because in Pedro Paramo, which was one of the I started off thinking I'm going to do a rewrite of Pedro Paramo, right? And I abandoned that fairly early on, but the early chapters you can still definitely see it. This is going to be this homage to Pedro Paramo, which is the story of a kind of ghost story, an early example of magic realism, if not like the example of magic realism, by Mexican author Juan Rulfo, who is credited by Gabriel Garcia Marquez as his influence, his major influence. And that story is about like this woman on her deathbed tells her son to go and find his notorious father. And so I thought, this kind of reversal, this could be really interesting. And then it, of course, became other things as well, right? So, but there is that layer there. At the same time, there's a very striking scene. I think it's in Krapp's Last Tape, actually, in Samuel Beckett's Krapp's Last Tape, where the character's remembering the death of his mother, and at the same time, he's thinking about the blinds and he's thinking about the dog next to him, and it is very minimalist, but at the same time, it creates, it does good worlding, like it shows you what's going on around, but it also creates this sense of loss and loneliness. And that weird moment when you're grieving and you're waiting to grieve, and you're remembering things and you're feeling the loss of them. And it's also weird and not quite real yet. And you feel like both the kind of reality of how fragile we are, and that reality of time that goes and it's gone, right? And at the same time, it feels impossible. Like most of the time you kind of live in this consciousness in this body, and you're walking around and you're in like deep denial about the fact that you're going to die, right? Everybody's going to die, right? Because otherwise you'd be unable to move, you'd be unable to do anything. But when someone you love is dying, you're really living with it, but you can't do anything, right? Other than be present. And there's something excruciating and beautiful about the detail of being present in those moments when you're just like, oh, that light is still flickering, right? Like, or, oh, that, like, there's a high level of specificity to your love at that moment.
And there's almost an unreality, I think.
Yeah.
It's a weird example, but I always think along these same lines of this Nick Cage film called Mandy, where, he watches his wife kind of being burned alive in front of him. And then the next thing that happens, he goes into these, he walks in the living room, there's the TV still on, and it's playing a commercial for Cheese Goblin. And it's the stupidest thing in the world. And it's just, he's just gone through this absolutely meaningful experience, and now is the most meaningless experience possible, just right alongside it. It's such an unreality and a weirdness in terms of when you are present in the world in that way.
And it really produces this cognitive dissonance, right? Because most of the time you manage to kind of smooth over and sort the fact that there's these weird commercials in the middle of this like really compelling show, and the dog is barking, and like you manage to put it into one whole reality, but sometimes that breaks down for you. And so that was kind of what I was trying to get at with that. And I guess in terms of my style, it's very much a style of layering, right? And
also fragments along the lines that you're talking about. You kind of are moving back and forth between these stories. You've got these like historical documents and fragments, and drawing on a history of fragments. Yeah.
I want to trust the reader and let it be their book, because it's not my book anymore. And they will put things together differently, and different sentences will mean something to them. And so I try to make room for the reader, instead of like over explaining what I mean, or, trying to control and make sure that they get the message and make sure that they understand all the references. And I think that's my answer to that.
Does anyone else have a question they want to jump in here as we're kind of tying things up with Natalee? Any other questions anyone wants to pop in to ask?
I can take one more if you want.
Otherwise, Natalee, I'd like maybe, unless Di, do you have a question? I see you unmuting.
I do.
Great. Okay, great. Hi, Di.
Hold on a sec. Hi, Natalee. So nice to see you and hear you.
Nice to see you.
What your work? Do you really believe this postmodern trope that there is not such a thing as a true story?
No.
As the right story? I mean, don't you?
I believe that, I think when you talk about truth or the right, when you talk about truth or right, then I suppose I don't believe in the cynical version of that, right? That there's nothing real is what it implies. And I feel like you're constantly there is something that is really happening. It's constantly changing, and you can't pin it down and explain it and explain it in all the ways that it means something to everyone. Right. So like, I can't explain Calamity Jane. I can't tell you who she was. But there is something that is, and I don't believe that even postmodernism is really trying to take away that sense of this is real. I think what Derrida was trying to do was have people question authority and prevent another Holocaust, right? Like he's this post-Holocaust Jewish guy trying to say, you have to question nationalism. You have to question the big stories, and you have to question every story. You have to question your own story and why you're telling it. You have to take responsibility for the impact of the way you organize facts and that sort of thing, right? And I think that's in the wake of the damage of a lot of nationalism and ideologies that are aimed at the bodies of people. And so I think what he's really trying to, I don't know, I'm not Derrida, but I feel like what I would say is that I embrace postmodernism's desire to prevent ideology from becoming a body that has power to injure other real flesh and blood bodies, right? And that we should question our stories, and we should question why we tell them, and we should listen to the perspectives of other people and understand that those perspectives too are complex and real, and we should be very suspicious of modalities that try to get us to act on others out of some kind of loyalty, right? So does that answer your question?
That's a very beautiful answer. Thank you very much. It's eloquent, and it is ethically committed, while at the same time being open to questioning. So that's lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks again to everyone, and to you, Natalie, for this lovely chat. I'll be here to talk to my students a bit more, but I know you've got to go. And I just wanted to thank you again for joining us and for writing such a wonderful book.
You've got 4 minutes. I can answer one more question.
Well, has anyone got another question they want to throw at Natalie, or I can throw one otherwise? But I'm first just kind of following up on what we were just talking about. I'm really interested in the way you kind of move towards closing the novel, because it's bound up in postmodern thought and deconstructionist thought and so on, is this critique of teleology and this idea that things are moving towards a particular ending or direction, and so much of, as you were just sort of more eloquently saying, so much of that philosophy is bound up in trying to deny the idea of a progression toward a thing as being some inevitable direction that you could then skip ahead, right? And I think so much of the programs of the 20th century that were damaging programs were programs of trying to move faster. Let's get eugenics in here and get closer to the human evolutionary endpoint, which of course doesn't exist, and so the whole thing's doomed to failure and becomes just a massive problem of consuming and destroying bodies. But so there's that teleological thrust where things are moving in a direction, and some imagined endpoint of history starts to become a critique. What of course it provides, and I think Kafka really anticipated this stylistically in a manner and started writing these novels that even I think he kind of didn't realize what he's doing. He was frustrating himself. He starts to write novels that where the structure of the story produces a non-ending, and you can't end the thing, and it just is going to interminably go on forever. He gets frustrated with it, but it is sort of this radical, revolutionary, pre-postmodern movement. You're here trying to write a book like Kafka, and maybe making it funnier and more entertaining in some ways, but you've got that same problem of how do you move to an finish the damn thing, but also have a kind of a non-ending, but still have a satisfactory climactic set of moments. I'm curious to know how you kind of settled on where you landed.
Well, I mean, I begin with the father's death and I end with the mother's death. There's the closing of the Old West, and some of the underlying argument of the book is that it's actually the closing of the Old West that creates the Old West, because that's a mythology. It's not a real place. So it's only when the Old West closes that then they can tell all these stories about who these people were, and they could, force these great indigenous leaders to go on they can come off of the out of prison so that they can perform their defeat at a battle on these traveling carnivals, right? And they can they can get Calamity Jane, and they can get these people performing who they were and their demise, their kind of social demise. So I had that kind of thing. At the same time, I think that I wanted it to be very cyclical, right? I wanted it to be a story, and that's why it has it has an ending. It has the show of the ending. It has the epilogue, and the epilogue kind of folds in myself and my child as kind of proxies for my actual self and child. And so, because you are also not a story that you tell yourself about yourself. And so, I was quite comfortable with the idea that this would be a story that you could keep inserting characters into too, or that people could, they could write scenes that because when I was traveling and I was performing from the book, people would tell me their stories of how their great aunt met Calamity Jane, or not their great aunt, but their, great, and or like that they have an aunt who's a rancher, or so everybody had connections, and I felt like those things belong just as much in the book. So I liked the openness of it in that way.
I also feel like there's a degree to which the novel is sort of opening up a mythology, or trying to reopen the mythology, or reopen the making of this mythology in a way that, as you kind of note, like they kind of have to close the story and kill everybody in order to kind of
they can say whatever they want.
Yeah, in order to kind of have like the tabula rasa, or whatever you want to call it. Like it doesn't, once the story is over, it can be codified into history. Yeah. And so if you can keep it open, or if you can kind of add to it, or if you can revitalize it, or just, start to trouble it, there's just the way in which now you can start to free it up a bit and take it away from the nation building a little bit, and start to realize, remember that there's a real person here, and, who knows the truth of that person's story. But there is this irreducible aspect that we can't pretend we all have access to.
Yeah. Well, I had a great conversation with you. Thank you so much. And please feel free to show.
Thanks so much for coming.
I gave Jonathan, so I was recently up in Golden, went for a walk with wolves. So there's a picture of me with wolves, but there's also a picture of my cousin Heather and Calamity Jane. And so when I was halfway through the novel,
Calamity Jane,
I was my cousin was murdered, and I gave up on the novel. And then one day I was picking through research, and I saw that they looked, to my eye, shockingly similar. And that was like this moment of like, these people that are forgotten should not be forgotten. Anyway, thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for joining. Thanks again to Natalee.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.